Hello, it's wonderful to be with everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for that introduction, and to Cafe Culture for the invitation here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've got like pages of questions here, but I will try and keep a lid on it. Beronda's book, just remarkable set of insights into both the lives of plants, but then what we might gain through thinking about the lives of plants, about our own lives, and both as individuals, but also collectively as institutions. And it's such an honor for me to be here chatting with you this afternoon in the US and this evening in the UK. For those of you who are football fans in the UK, we're the pre-game show, getting you ready to observe the turf at Wembley Stadium and think about the grasses under the players' feet in a completely different way, and realizing that the grasses are far more interesting than the game, perhaps. Beronda, would you like to kick us off with a reading or some reflections before we move into discussion?
Yeah, I do a short reading. I did just want to say thank you for being here. I think you're such a beautifully lyrical writer, and I wrote this book to invite myself into conversations with others such as you. So thank you for being here today, David. I'm going to read a short section from chapter 5 on a diverse community, something I've been thinking about the last couple of days in particular. In the summer, I often visit a field filled with wildflowers. Some are so small you almost overlook them, while some reach a foot high and others stretch twice that, and they sport a rainbow of blooms. I'm captivated by the variety of forms and colors that make up the community. As I gaze at the spectacle, I contemplate how all of these different species manage to coexist. Although I'm filled with awe by the diversity in this place, many people walk, bicycle, and drive by without noticing this thriving ecosystem. They're lacking in plant awareness. I ponder how they could pass by without pausing, if only for a moment, to marvel at the array of plants in the field and consider the complex interactions that are going on above ground and under the soil. Scientists studying biodiversity in plant communities have found that many different species can peacefully coexist, in part because of a phenomenon called niche complementarity. Each species occupies a slightly different niche, a position in the community defined by its life history, use of resources, and interactions with other species. Because each species and even each genetic variant within a species has different needs, the result is maximal use of resources in a particular community or ecosystem. Not only does diversity benefit individual plants, but the unique abilities and behaviors of different species benefit the collective. Ecosystems with great biodiversity tend to be more productive. That is, they produce more biomass, more leaves, stems, fruits, and other plant parts. Today, commercial agriculture is characterized by vast monocultures of corn, soybeans, and wheat. While this practice makes planting and harvesting easier, it's not the only way to grow crops. Farmers in indigenous cultures around the world have long used a technique called intercropping, which involves planting 2 or more crops together, just as in natural ecosystems. It turns out that productivity is higher when certain crops are planted together in polycultures rather than in monocultures. Intercropping increases the productivity of individual plants through a process known as interspecific facilitation. Each species contributes something that promotes the growth, reproduction, or persistence of the others. Because individuals in each species use different strategies for acquiring resources, they're able to divide up the resources instead of competing for them. One of the best examples of intercropping is a venerable planting style called Three Sisters. This method of cultivation, which involves planting corn, beans, and squash together, has long been practiced by many Native American peoples. With deep respect for the gift of the Three Sisters and other traditional ecological knowledge, but with no intention of co-opting that knowledge, I explore what wisdom can be gained from deep contemplation of and reflection on this practice.
Beautiful, thank you. Thank you. The vision of facilitation and of complementarity stands in sharp contrast to some paradigms in biology. I'm thinking of Tennyson, who tells us nature is red in tooth and claw, and sort of emphasizing the competitive nature and indeed the selfish nature of every individual, every gene for themselves, and so forth. Yeah. And of course, there's competition. out in the world. That's not, and predation and blood and so forth. But you're really emphasizing the possibility for kind of reciprocity and mutualism here as you look at the meadow. How does that play out with the three sisters?
Yeah, so the Three Sisters is just such a beautifully inspiring story that I was aware of as a kindergartner. We talked about it around Thanksgiving time. And then later in my life, I had the privilege of hearing Robin Wall Kimmerer talk about her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, in which certainly she introduces this concept of the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans, which are grown together as intercrops by many indigenous farmers. There are other pairings across the globe, including some in the global South. But with the three sisters, it's the idea that each of the sisters has a role in their relationship, and it really is about reciprocity. Corn emerges first and grows tall. Bean emerges second and uses corn, the first sister, as a physical support. The bean collaborates with bacteria to fix nitrogen into a soluble form that can be used by plants as a fertilizer. And in so doing, it makes enough to give some back to the first sister for providing the physical support. And then the third sister, squash, grows kind of low and close to the ground, often along the edges of these fields, protecting other plants, usually weeds, from coming in. So providing protection from other plants, but also protecting the soil. And in protecting the soil, it keeps the soil moist, keeps other weeds from growing, thereby allowing the first two sisters as well as the squash to grow. And in return for her protection, she gets some of the nitrogen from the bean, whose ability to produce that is supported by the corn. So it's just this beautiful relationship. And I always say that although we don't need scientific evidence to prove that this is important, because people have been doing it for years because of their indigenous knowledge, we do know based on scientific knowledge that the three of them grow better together than they would in isolation. And so I think it's just a great inspiration for where we can draw other forms of knowledge. But also, I do talk about competition in the book. Plants certainly compete, but they still do it differently from humans. I think more wisely than humans.
That's great. And the Three Sisters, of course, is a system, as you point out, that has been developed through careful observation and through empirical research.
Yes.
I mean, using scientific language here, over many generations, and takes different forms, of course, in different cultures. And yet this principle also applies, say, in a prairie where people have had a much lighter touch. I mean, people are still involved in the history of the prairies in America and the forests all over the world, but the sense of reciprocity and the potential for mutually supportive and reciprocal relationships is present in ecosystems which are not agricultural as well. What are some of the principles that allow that to happen in an admittedly challenging environment where nutrients are in short supply? There's only one plant can only be at the, there's only one that can be at the top, shading the others. I mean, that's not strictly true because plants exist in a spatial patchwork, but what are some of the principles that allow that kind of reciprocity to happen?
Yeah, so certainly you're absolutely correct. In most natural ecosystems, you find this reciprocity and competition and all of those things happening apart from cultivation, as we would talk about in the Three Sisters. And part of it is certainly these plants growing over evolution and adapting to what's available there. And certainly plants are like humans. If you're growing in a space where you're competing for the same thing, two plants need exactly the same thing. You spend more of your energy competing than you do growing. So over time, plants do kind of group together with other plants that use complementary parts of the ecosystem. Sometimes they're using different things and kind of ignoring each other. Sometimes they're actually collaborating, as with the bean and the corn, where one plant may be providing shade for one that doesn't like to grow in full sunlight, or one may be producing, an anti-herbivore compound that protects everyone. And a lot of this is really about evolution over time. It's about over time, you grow better with those that you can compete with just enough to compete, but mostly collaborate with. And over time, those plants stay together. Over evolution.
And you mentioned right at the beginning that monoculture is how we often do agriculture now. And of course, that's only possible because of a massive subsidy from chemicals mostly derived from fossil fuels and from fertilizers and so forth. So we create these very, very productive systems, but they're productive in a very narrow range that requires a lot of input from elsewhere.
Absolutely. So they're productive in the sense that they allow us to have ease of planting and it's more about productivity that benefits us in terms of our harvesting. But certainly we have to put a lot of inputs back into the environment to maintain that over time, which is costing us, as we see, in terms of, climate change and degradation of our ecosystem. So, yes.
So what might we learn? I mean, you mentioned that plants do this in a much wiser way often than humans. And of course, plants have been at it for hundreds of millions of years, whereas
Yes.
we humans are still, we're a young species and it shows.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. We're a young species, but we think we have the most wisdom, which is what's getting us into trouble time and time again. I think about many of the things that I've learned from plants are looking at how they compete, because I love to focus on facilitation and collaboration, but it's undoubtable that we have to compete at times, just the way that our ecosystems are. But the reason I say it's different, humans have this need to compete to the death. If we're competing, I need to completely obliterate you and have this kind of, I'm the winner of this fight. Whereas plants generally, there's certainly different examples, but as a general principle, plants compete with other plants until they get access to what they need, and then they no longer put energy into that competition. And so they use energy just to get themselves in a position to have what they need to have access for their own life, and then the competition can stop. We often keep competing, even when we have gotten what we need. We keep competing. I don't think there's such a parallel of billionaires in the plant kingdom. Maybe there are, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, well, tax avoidance is much harder in the plant kingdom, which puts a cap on that. Yeah, so I mean, you have a distinguished career as a biochemist. I know you also have been doing some work helping deans and others, within institutions of higher education,
Yes.
think about their work, think about working together. And if you were to take a walk in a meadow, say, as you began your reading, this beautiful image of flowers, plants growing together in a very diverse ecosystem, if you were to walk with some of these leaders through that, what would you point out to them and say, well, take this little observation home and think about it a little bit, about how you, working within the ecosystem of a human institution, in this case higher education, but it applies on all human institutions, what might we take away from that?
Yeah, I think there's so much for us from, just for us to learn as humans, and particularly those who do have some responsibility as leaders or mentors in environments, to look at what we can learn from the natural world. And I've had a walking meeting with one of my favorite deans in the College of Arts and Letters, and we walk around and look at the trees, and we had some trees that were suffering from a disease a few years ago. And I said to him, what do you think is going on here? And he says, well, there's something that's impeding the trees from growing healthily. They've been healthy for a long time. I said, that's a really interesting perspective. You've had some faculty who have been, teachers and others who've been struggling, and you keep pointing to them at the problem. But when you looked at these trees, you said something happened that's causing the trees not to grow well. And so I really try to draw those examples, because I think too frequently in our higher education spaces, in business spaces, and even in community spaces, we often enter it from a deficit framing and a gatekeeping perspective. We like to identify people who we think are going to be successful and allow them into our spaces to demonstrate their success as if it's our own. And those who are struggling, we don't want any part of them. We have these highly exclusive universities, and we're very proud of that. But I really think that as we could get leaders to think about themselves as having responsibility for care of an ecosystem, they would look at how the beings in their space are thriving or not differently, and really start to ask questions about what role they could play in ensuring that they have everything they need around them to be successful. So it really goes to this perspective I think I talk about a lot. Most humans believe that plants should grow. And if plants aren't growing, they start to ask questions about the environment. Does it need water or nutrients? Or does it need to be closer to a window? Or they'll ask questions about their caretaking abilities. And we don't do that same thing with our other human beings, unfortunately.
Yeah, that sort of reframes the way of thinking about things away from the individual and towards the collective, and towards thinking about what might be missing in this environment that is causing this particular person not to thrive in this place. Yeah. And particularly in higher education, where at least certainly in North America, it's all about, not all, but a large part, assigning numbers to people, GPAs
Yes,
and H indices for faculty and so forth, that
yes,
is all focused on the individual rather than how is this community thriving and what might that community be doing or not doing to help the individuals within. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's critical for these kinds of spaces because we prize ourselves on our selection processes and we don't quote let anybody in. We select people who have demonstrated success before they came to us. And so the expectation should be that they will continue to be successful. And
Mhm.
so I've never understood why when we select people who have a record of success, often in multiple environments before they came to ours, if they come to our environment and start to struggle, why the question isn't about what happened to them. What did we do to derail them, right? And that's not the general ways we think about these things. And we
Yeah.
don't do that with plants. We don't look at a plant that's yellow green and say, you poor plant are incapable of greening. You must get out of this space. You know, we really do ask questions about what it needs access to.
Yeah. No, that's, I mean, and I love the idea of having walking meetings and actually and inviting other species into the human conversation and say, well, let's listen to this plant and observe and get outside of if we could have more human meetings in spaces where other beings were present, particularly plants, we might be guided into different paths.
I think it can really be a breakthrough because too frequently, particularly if they're difficult discussions, in the US for the past year, we've been having intense discussions about race. And if you have, you know, people from two different races start to talk about that, often the biggest fear is that I'm about to say you're racist or you're about to say something about me. And often if we can talk about other beings, we can get farther into the conversation and hopefully make some progress as opposed to hitting these defensive walls that can happen so frequently.
Wow. I mean, it's such a beautiful vision of how embeddedness within ecosystems can help human conversations and can help human interconnectivity. So often we think, well, those, you know, well, we eat plants, some of us eat animals and so forth, and they're very utilitarian. We're going to just consume, and that's it, rather than, oh, by embedding ourselves into these other places, our own way of relating to one another might be different.
Yes, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Now you jump right into this book, into some controversial questions of plant intelligence and behavior and memory. And so now they're becoming less controversial, fortunately, as people's imaginations expand here. But I'm wondering if you could help us understand what, say early on in the book, when you're talking about plants making decisions or having memory and learning, you don't mean that as a metaphor. You mean that quite literally, that the plants are doing this, but in ways that are a little alien to how humans, we're all about the nervous system and the cranium, which plants don't have. Could you walk us through a little bit what those terms mean in a plant, and how does a plant have memory and make decisions at a whole plant level, but then perhaps down to the biochemical level?
Yeah, so we've learned a lot over the years about how plant makes decision. I think of them sometimes as molecular decisions, right? Because they don't have a brain. But I think, you know, just to back up a moment, I think we limit ourselves from understanding that plants and other organisms have awareness, have intelligence, if you like to use that word, have memory, because we define these based upon our human understanding of those words. And if we limit ourselves to intelligence being human intelligence, then nobody else has intelligence like we do, right? Plants or others. And so I think if we understand awareness as being in a space, being able to perceive what's going on around you, to process that, and then to change your behaviors based on that, plants do that, I think, in as many ways as humans do. But we just don't, we limit ourselves in terms of understanding. And we know they do this in many ways. Sometimes it's producing a chemical. So if a plant is bitten by an insect that likes to munch on the leaf, the plant will produce some volatile organic compounds. And most of us know these as the scents we know for basil or roses. That's actually the language of the plant. And a very specific mix of those chemicals indicates that the plant has been damaged. And that can serve as a signal for the plant to put off its protection and to other neighboring plants to protect themselves preemptively. So they have chemical language. There also seems to be electronic language, electric signals that can go. There are so many different ways that plants communicate, including ways as humans. So changing our gene expression, changing which genes are being used to make proteins, which give us the ability to have some biochemical function. And we know, I believe, there's a great understanding about plant memory. Our biggest, the one that's known most scientifically is how plants remember that they've been in winter. So some plants have this process that if they've been through winter, it's called vernalization. There are these flags, markers that are added to the DNA that show that winter has passed. And some plants only use that signal to know that they've gone through winter and now it's spring and they should flower. In the absence of that, they don't know that they've been through winter. And so they remember winter. And we know through some studies that that can be passed on to the offspring. And so it seems that there's also intergenerational memory cues that happen in plants. And there's quite a bit known about that in plants. We're still trying to understand that in humans in some cases, the intergenerational part at least.
So if I understand you right, so it's not the DNA, it's the sequence of the DNA that's changed. It's a little tag that's added to the DNA.
Yes.
That says we've been through this kind of a winter. Is that correct?
So it can be methylation or other chemical, means of doing that, but it's basically flags that are added. The DNA sequence doesn't change, but these flags are added and they become markers that the plant has been exposed to winter. And if you've been exposed to winter, there are certain sets of behaviors that make sense because spring comes after winter and you should be doing spring-like behaviors after you've had those markers added. Yes.
Yeah, I feel that myself. Sometimes in time to open some buds, I forget where they are, but
yes.
Yeah, so this is that example goes in the face of things I learned in high school. Certainly was that the only thing that goes from one generation to another is the DNA sequence from through the eggs and pollen grains and so forth. But here we're learning that there's this form of memory that lasts a little while, but is not permanent.
That's right. Yes.
Are there shorter term forms of memory as well that might last just a few minutes or a few days or weeks?
Yes, absolutely. So there are lots of, you can either look at electronic signals to find out that some plants have a touch memory. So if you touch them, there'll be a signal that they've been touched. But if you touch them repeatedly, they no longer have that signal after a time because they realize this is a repetitive action and they don't need to respond. You can see this physically with some plants like a mimosa, which are the plants that if you touch them, they will close their leaves. And often in nature, that would be a sign that perhaps a bug has landed on them. So they're closing to limit the amount of damage. Sometimes it can be bright sunlight has hit the leaves and they close to protect themselves from the equivalent of sunburn. But often if you repeat that signal over several times, they won't respond to it any longer. And so there are those shorter, those last for a while, and then the system will get reset. I think about it like, I have a child and I just remember if he pecked me once or twice, I'd say, what do you need? But if he kept doing it, I thought he really doesn't want anything. I'm going to ignore it and we're going to reset, right? And so it's those kinds of things that can happen in nature as well.
That's great. Well, I'm looking forward to your sequel, which is parenting lessons from plants. I'm just thinking that there are so many different ways that plants give a boost and help or guide their offspring, right? From fruit and so on. That really would be an interesting approach there. So memory is existing on all sorts of different time scales, some very short, some longer. You also give some great examples in the book of decision making of plants choosing one path or another behaviorally, and including making decisions like risk assessment and return on investment calculations and so forth. And those are terms that to me are very, they're sort of very human from the business world and so forth. And I think a lot of people would have a hard time thinking, how is a plant going to make an ROI, a return on investment, assessment or risk assessment? How do those things play out? I mean, from your perspective as a biochemist, when you look at a plant, you see that. What's
Yeah.
happening?
I think it's absolutely critical for plants to be able to do that, because some of the things that, if we're houseplant growers, that we marvel over so much, like the emergence of a new leaf or our root system expanding, those are actually risky decisions for plants to make. So it's a lot of energy that's required to make a new leaf. And if you start to make a new leaf before really having an assessment that you have enough energy or the environment is sufficient to support that, that's a complete waste of energy that the plant can't get back. And so these kinds of decisions about when and where it's time to make new leaves or when and where it's time to flower are critical. And so the plant is usually assessing the environment to determine if the factors needed are there or if danger is ahead. Right. So plants will often flower when they know that maybe winter is coming, and if they don't flower soon, they won't have time to complete the full seed cycle. And so the cues that plants use to make these decisions are what the temperature is. Is it the right time of the season to make leaves or to transition to flowering? They measure how much light is available, and often they're measuring light and temperature as combined cues. And those get converted into chemical signatures or changes in DNA expression, gene expression, to really get the behavior that we see, right? So we see the outcome, the plant makes a new leaf or not. But before that new leaf emerges, the plant has assessed how much energy it has, how much energy it needs to respond to certain things. So you talked about these trade-offs. Often if the environment generally looks like it's positive for a new leaf to emerge, but there are lots of insect predators, plants are assessing that, and the energy gets converted into making things to to defend against the insects, as opposed to making a leaf. And we can see the biochemical and gene expression signatures for that, how plants are reading these cues and prioritizing. Should I make a new leaf, or do I really need to ward off the danger that's happening from potential herbivores? And all of this matched to seasons, right? Whether it's spring or summer or winter.
Yeah, it's just such. I love the way that changes how we humans would perceive a leaf. So certainly in my own work as a teacher, one of the challenges is inviting students into the realization that what seems like a very passive, still thing, a tree with some leaves, it looks the same now as it did an hour ago. It's just, I mean, it might as well be dead. Right?
Yes.
And you referred to that as sort of a lack of plant awareness. But in fact, there's all these little measurements and happening. Chemicals are zipping back and forth, and there's almost like some little scales inside the leaf that's making decision this way or that way. And so now walking through the woods, or looking at grasses growing, say under footballers' feet, realize, oh, there are all kinds of assessments happening there in ways that are very analogous to some of the things that we do in our own lives.
Absolutely.
What should we take away? So plants have been out there for hundreds of millions of years, figuring out how to apportion their energy budgets, how to make decisions, often on the fly, often in the face of uncertainty and unpredictability. What might we learn from those decision-making processes?
I think one of the strongest lessons that I've really taken from it, and that's resonated with a lot of people, are that as humans, we have certainly the ability to know what's going on around us, but we often have the same behavior independent of what's going on around us, particularly in terms of the ways in the US where we work incessantly, right? Whereas plants are working very hard right now in the summer. This is one of their busiest seasons for making sugars and storing them and making new leaves. But when they start to assess that fall is coming, they will start to prepare for a different season where temperatures will cool, there may be less light, and so they can't keep out that full out activity. And then winter is this period of rest. And I think that one of the things as humans, we assess what's going on around us and keep doing the same thing. And often, particularly, we don't match our work to the seasons in our life. We often have to be forced into rest. We don't anticipate rest, actively prepare for it, and then enter it and enjoy it. You know, we have to be forced into rest because we've worked ourselves to exhaustion, or we have a global pandemic and we refuse to understand what global means. And so then it lasts for longer because we refuse to respond to knowledge and the cues. And so I think this way that plants sense what's going on around them and then respond appropriately has a real lesson for us. And I think we think of ourselves, I think that humans often act as if we're in perpetual summer, that we have as much sunlight as we want, to have as much energy as we want, and we run ourselves into exhaustion and then have to rest. And I've learned to rest is so much more fulfilling when you prepare for it and enjoy it, as opposed to being forced into it.
Yeah, and we're in structures, institutions and economic systems that in many ways necessitate that kind of, or at least very strongly encourage and reward, at least in the short term, that kind of behavior. So how might we, I mean, as individuals, we can, and you have some wonderful analogies and examples to encourage us as individuals, but you also say things about how institutions might help learn some of this wisdom of plants, because we all live embedded within particular structures.
Yes. And I think that, you know, part of it goes back to what you were talking about before. The way our systems are set up, we use these quantitative metrics that don't have seasons, right? It's just always get more, get better, do more, be better. And I think that, you know, we have to, one of the reasons in the past few years I started working on leadership is that I realized that if we want life to be better for us individually, we have to have leaders who understand ecosystem perspectives. They understand these nature lessons from nature that we can take. And I've been trying to introduce some of those in conversation. So I'm not really sure if people just let me in because the stories are charming. I hope they're having some impact, but I really think we have to move away from, you know, even having leaders who are judged on how well they get us to work too hard all the time, to how much they care for individuals and the ecosystem, still getting to outcomes that we need.
Yeah, I mean, those structures constrain leaders just as much as they constrain others. Yeah, you know, I had one question sort of about leadership. One of the points that you made in your book was talking about changes through plant succession, where often, say after a landslide or a volcano or something, there'll be pioneering species that come in and then open opportunities for others. But those pioneers in plant ecosystems often then bring about their own demise because they change conditions and other plants move in. And of course, in human systems, we have pioneers, people who are bringing change, sometimes revolutionary change. How might we learn from that process of plant succession and perhaps even adapt it to humans where we don't destroy the pioneers after their work is done? And by pioneer,
that's one of the places where I think we could make massive change. Right now, my estimation from the systems I've worked in and systems I've worked with in consulting, we get ourselves locked into a certain kind of leader. I remember a few years ago, I was consulting with another institution, so as not to implicate my own institution, on a search for an executive leader. And they said, well, this person may come in and only be here for 5 years. And we don't want to do that. It's too big of an investment. Well, what if you brought someone in for 5 years who course corrected? And after they course corrected, then you get the leader who will be there for 10 or 15 years. We don't value that right now. We don't value pioneers in that way. And I think for some of the changes that we purport to want in some of these spaces, that there are some people who, one of my good friends, I could easily see him having a job for 4 years, every 4 years at a different institution as a pioneer. But right now, we don't look at that as a viable pathway to leadership. We think something's wrong with that. So we really have to rethink the importance of pioneers for getting certain change set. And then you bring in the people who sustain. Right now, we select leaders who are status quo leaders. They basically keep the status quo and elevate us a little bit. But if there are certain issues that come up, diversity and equity, working on new issues such as climate change, where you might just need a pioneer to come in and really disrupt the ecosystem so that you have the ability to do something else. We really have to rethink leadership in that regard. Otherwise, it takes only a few people who don't mind doing that on their own, but they take a risk in terms of the ways we think about career stability.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and certainly in higher education, there is a lot more emphasis on the status quo than in some other areas. It's one of the most fossilized uh, areas.
That is so. And, I don't often point to the corporate world as an example because of my own biases in politics. But I do think that certain parts of the corporate world understand the importance of pioneers and understand that occasionally you have to bring in a short-term leader to redirect. And I think there are many other sectors of our I wish we would do that in politics sometimes. Like we wouldn't have a senator who had been a 50-year senator, but maybe we need to bring in people on a more rotation in certain areas.
Right. I can think of some who should be on very, very short rotations, a minute or two, and then we're done. So, yeah, and of course, that's how, as you point out in the book, that's how plant communities work. When there's a disturbance, there's a series of different species that come in that change, that actually build soil and open possibilities for other species that come along after them. And of course, the trajectory of that differs depending very much on the ecosystem. We have a number of questions here in the Q&A box. Maybe we could turn to a few of those. So Margaret Heath is asking, she says she's concerned with the trend with evolutionary theory applied to social network dynamics, which focuses on competition and cooperation without any concept of collaboration. And she asked, can you think of any plant that doesn't collaborate using various mechanisms? What are those? Or presumably, if not, what might we learn from this collaborative process that gets beyond either just straight up cooperation or competition?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly there are some plants that basically live as they live off of other plants, right? They don't often make their own sugars. They really do use other plants as host. And so they certainly are not living independently. But I really resonate with this idea of cooperation versus collaboration. I think we do talk more about competition and cooperation in social networks because of our fascination with individualism. And we're always focused on, if I compete, I do it because it's the right thing for me to do as an individual. If I cooperate, it's still about me as an individual. And collaboration is really getting us to shift from this individual perspective to see ourselves as a part of a collective. And that's hard in most of our societies because we, in many societies, still prize this kind of false models of individual success or individual kind of rising and conquering. And so it really takes us focusing on not just the individual, but the collective. I was hoping that this moment, this global pandemic, was going to be a moment for us to really understand a little bit more about collaboration and the collective, because we've had times in the past where there was a national crisis, but this global crisis, which really showed us how connected we are, even when we don't want to accept it, I hoped was going to be a moment that we would stop and say, we're going to emerge from this understanding individual and collective differently. I'm not so sure we're going to learn as many lessons as I hoped. I haven't given up hope yet, but as you kind of see that uneven ways that some things have rolled out across the globe, I think that, in her question, there's a lot for us to really think about how we talk more and understand more the power of the collective over this individual fascination we have.
I'm wondering if you could comment on, and this is something I've thought about a little bit, is just even the notion of the individual as it relates to plants is problematic. And I'd argue for humans as well. We seem to be,
yes,
whereas we're not. In what way of course, say I'm looking at an oak tree, it seems like an individual to me, but as a microbiologist, biochemist, botanist, what would you tell me to disabuse me of that notion, to say, no, that isn't an individual?
Yeah, we know that most plants do not exist as an individual. They have a microbiome. They have microbes living in and on them, just like humans. And also, in terms of what we know about the roots of plants are a community. We talk about them as plant roots, but there are bacteria, there are fungi. Susan Simmert has this great book out now on the fungi, finding the mother tree. But in nature, plants are living in a community and their success is dependent on that. And we know that now. There are scientists, including a colleague of mine, who have tried to grow plants azenically, where they have no bacteria, nothing that are attached to them. Those plants suffer. Because to really exist in nature, much like we know we have bacteria that participate in our gut to help make vitamins, plants exist in this interconnected web with other biological organisms to exist in nature. And that's one of the reasons there are lots of these memes online about how a plant in nature grows well, and then in the house, it's so sensitive and so needy. That's because we've disconnected it from a lot of its other biological partners that it collaborates with or cooperates with in nature.
In the same way that an individual might show up in a particular institution and not do so well because they've lost all the.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah, and even that, I mean, I'm sort of looking out the window now, seeing some green trees and so on, and remembering that the green in the plants is in fact a little formerly independent cell. We now call it the chloroplast, living inside the bigger cell. So the plant cell itself is a combination of 3 different.
That's right.
Evolutionary lineages. So it's an amazing example of a
That's
living.
Very true. The very cell itself. Yes. Yeah.
Another question here from the Q&A box. Christopher Hill says, you've described plants as having a form of memory, essential capacities, awareness, etc. What are the typical indicators of consciousness? If plants have their own form of consciousness, then what does this tell us about the capacity of plants to suffer? And how might this either resemble or differ from animal suffering?
Yeah, so plant suffering that we recognize as humans is, when the leaves are atrophying or the leaves are wilting or they're stunted in their growth. And often that's a case of not having enough access to an environment. It's a limitation of nutrients. And we can see similar kinds of suffering in humans, where if you don't have enough food, you exhibit malnutrition. The distinctions that we don't understand are that humans have other kind of suffering. So last year I was suffering because my son was away in college and I was here in the pandemic alone. That was a form of suffering. We don't recognize that form of suffering in plants, but that's not to say that plants in isolation don't have some kind of similar awareness that they're away from other plants that they grow well with in nature. So I think there are those kinds of commonalities where if you don't have enough nutrients, you don't grow well. If you, that there can be other kind of damage that you see actual suffering in terms of a plant's yellowing or leaves falling off. And then there are other forms of suffering that we recognize in animals that may be distinct from what plants. And I would imagine there's also a form of plant suffering that we have no conception of. And those are the things that keep me up at night, thinking about all the things about plants that we don't yet know that are fascinating.
If you, and you may not want to answer this question, but if you were to hazard a guess on this question of plant consciousness, because of course consciousness, it is possible for say, my computer is making decisions, but I would not ascribe consciousness to it. Where do you stand on this notion of subjective internal experience for plants?
Yeah, I think part of my kind of way of being on the planet is to assume that plants have consciousness, but I'm completely okay with understanding that that's different from my understanding of consciousness. And I think that's where we get ourselves in a trap. We want to say plants are either conscious like we are or not. And otherwise, I think we oversubscribe what our consciousness is, and we elevate what our consciousness is. And some of our behaviors we might think are so intelligent and so demonstration of our consciousness, and other beings on this planet may be mocking us like we look at plants and say they have no consciousness. Other beings on this planet may be looking, these people have no consciousness. They're actually ruining their earth. They're ruining their home. How could you have consciousness? And so I kind of err on the side of thinking I don't understand it all, but I think that there are things that are definitely going on with plants that are fascinating. And I would not want to say that they're not conscious because they're different than I am.
Yeah, amazing. Now, I love the idea of reframing how we think of our own consciousness.
Yes.
That I'm trying to, if I'm remembering the numbers right, but a tree with all the connections that it has in its leaves with other creatures and through its roots to the soil has as many or more connections with other beings and in a much more decentralized way than the human brain has connections. So this tree, if it does have consciousness, is in a way that consciousness is more deeply embedded in the network of beings around
Yes,
it.
absolutely. I agree with that fully. Yes. But I am much more fascinated with the question of why some people want plants to be conscious or don't want them. I'm much more fascinated with what that tells us about us, that we want to be the decider of other beings' experience on the planet.
Yeah. What is the right way to pose that question then?
You know, I
So,
often, when people ask me, are plants conscious? I ask them, what is their definition of consciousness? And then I will say, well, based on your definition, probably not, right? They may not be investing in a 401k. But I then also think, as I keep going back to the fact, I think we overinflate our own intelligence. And that's just that's my perception of the world. What about you? What do you think? I always find this fascinating for other people who study plants.
I'm agnostic. I don't know, and I don't think I can know, and I don't think
Yes.
anyone else can know what the nature of consciousness is and implies. I think the approach to it is the answer, if an answer can be found, or an approach to an answer, will not be found at the seminar table. It will be found through us, through me, you, others, being in actual lived relationship with plants. And that's one critique I would have of higher education, is so much of it is abstracted into the world of ideas. And so much of it is removed from actually just getting out there and smelling some plants, getting your hands in the soil and learning from the teachers, from plants, what they have to teach us on this particular day. And it's usually not what we expect we're going to be.
I really appreciate that answer, because I often look at the ways we think about which animals have intelligence and which don't. And we often put cats and dogs at the top. And I think that's because those are the ones we spend the most time with, right? It's really your point of having to spend time with and understand other organisms.
Yeah. So there's a question in Q&A from Let G, who asks, how much of plants' collaborative nature is attributed to mobility or to constraint? And what might humans learn as a species in often constant motion? Whereas, of course, most plants are rooted in place.
Yeah. So I do, a fair amount of the collaboration is about them having limited mobility. Certainly, when you look at where roots go, plants have slow mobility. But when you look at even where they move, a lot of that is really driven by them having access to a rather limited space compared to us being able to fly around the world, or perhaps to the moon soon, depending on how much money you have. And so a lot of the collaboration they have is about what's available. It's about what form it's available in. So often, they're collaborating. I think that when plants collaborate with bacteria and other microbes in the soil, it's because what they need is there, but they need to transform it into a form that they can use. They need to translate it. So a lot of that is about what's available, who's around, and how you can make the best of where you are in a particular space or transform that space.
Yeah, so they don't have the option of getting up and running away if it doesn't work out.
No, they can't run away. That's right.
So you got to make, it's good incentive to actually make things work and collaborate with others.
Yes.
So Becca Castagna has a question that I was going to ask you as we move towards the end of our conversation. And she says, thank you for the valuable concept of plant awareness. What might be initial steps in developing this for the average person, the non-botanist, the non-biologist? What would you suggest for people who wanted to increase their plant awareness and learn lessons from plants on their own?
Yeah. Two simple ways that I often suggest are, one, to think about how much you know the plants, your plant neighbors, the plants in your neighborhood. Like, do you know the trees that are in your yard, or are you only aware of the ones that drop leaves and you have to rake them? But how much do you know about the tree? What kind of tree it is? How much do you know about the flowers you choose for your garden and why you chose them? If you're only choosing them for color, have you looked at whether they generally grow well there? And if there's another one that grows better, that's the same color. But to really ask questions about the plants that are in our immediate environment. And then the other thing I suggest is for people to think about the ways in which plants show up in their everyday life. So plants really track our entire lives from birth to death. We give flowers to new mothers who've just had a baby. We bring flowers to Mother's Day. We have flowers at weddings. We have flowers at funerals. Flowers really have this kind of, and plants have this real important thing about peace lilies. I have several of them from when my dad passed away. And so plants and flowers have this kind of ways of showing up in our life, even for those of us who love to cook, the spices that we use. And I really get people to think about what in your everyday life, the source of it is from a plant, and what do you know about that plant? So I've been fascinated with the cultural aspects of plants because I couldn't figure out why we got so many peace lilies as a plant when my dad passed away. It's like, why is this the plant that shows up at funerals? And there are actually some cultural implications about those plants bringing peace and respite for people who might be in distress. But just really starting to ask questions about the plants that are a regular part of your life. And asking the other question I really press people to know is, what do they know about the sustainability of those? So if you love a certain kind of plant and we're having sustainability problems, then you have to ask yourselves questions about, is your temporal joy for having a certain kind of flower in the vase worth a contribution to a sustainability issue for our planet over the long time? So those are the kinds of ways I think you can start to interface with plants in everyday life, whether you study biology or botany or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for those invitations. I'll add, during the most severe parts of lockdown in the pandemic, my morning cup of tea actually became an important way to connect with plants, because I actually thought a lot about whose hands picked these tea leaves, which plant, and this is a camellia plant. Camellia sinensis is the plant that gives us tea leaves. Where did this plant evolve, and so on? So I did some reading and so forth to get my imagination and my mind, even though I was just locked up in a few small rooms, into other parts of the world, and particularly get my head back into the roots of this plant that was sustaining me in the most everyday thing, which is a cup of tea in the morning.
Absolutely. Yes.
What towards the end of the book, you mentioned that when your son was born, you planted a tree and have been following that tree ever since. Can you tell us what led you to that action? And what are a few of the lessons that you or he have learned over the years of watching that tree grow?
Yeah, so we had gotten a new house shortly after my son was born, and his dad grew up in the agricultural part of Uganda, and I grew up with parents who were really drawn to flowers and vegetable gardening. And we just wanted to do something that we would have to remember him beyond the season. And we decided we wanted to do some landscaping, and we decided we were going to let him pick a tree with some guidance. And we were going to plant a tree. So we chose a white spruce tree, and we planted it. He was barely as tall as the tree when we planted it. And literally we, every time we would do something with the tree or take care of it, we would try to find a way for him to know this was his tree that he had responsibility for. We wanted him to understand having responsibility for a living being other than yourself as well. And I remember, I think I talk about this in the book, when we shortly after we planted it, 2 years or so, was leaning. And so we had to put a string and pull it, with a stick to get it to go the other way. And he was not sure about this. He thought we were hurting the tree. And I was explaining to him that, just like when you're young, you have to have guidance and correction, that sometimes young saplings have to be redirected so that their growth is optimized. And so it's been those kinds of lessons. The tree got sick when he was about 7 or 8. And so he was very concerned about the tree having disease, and it recovered. And so we talked about this ability to recover and heal yourself in collaboration with someone taking care of you. So, we've had lots of lessons. The tree has been taller than him. He's now taller than the tree. He's an adult. The tree is not. Well, he's a legal adult, not an independent adult. But the tree is not yet. So we talk about this from time to time. And, when he was away at college, there was a storm and he asked about his tree, and we thought, oh, we got him. He really bought into the fact that this was his tree. It's taught him a lot of lessons, taught us a lot of lessons. And I think that's true of all plants if we open ourselves to that possibility.
Thank you. And that draws the modern human world into the heart of a human family and the bonds between parents and a child. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Well, Professor Beronda Montgomery, thank you so much. I encourage everyone, and there's a link in the chat here, to avail yourselves of Lessons from Plants, a wonderful book. And as Anthony pointed out, also really beautifully produced. I mean, gorgeous images on the front here, And then each of the chapters has a wonderful, it's not really showing up super well on Zoom here, wonderful line drawing, a little quote and so on to a pleasure for the senses, as well as for the mind. So your team at Harvard done a great job.
They did a great job. It's a beautiful book. I'm super proud of it.
I'm wondering if you have any closing thoughts or invitations or comments to people who are tuned in here on lessons from plants.
I think the invitation I like to leave people with is that, this book represents my fascination with plants and the things that I think I've learned from them. But I think all of us, whatever our interests are or our profession is, we sit with some knowledge that has the capacity to increase our ability to be thoughtful beings on the planet. And I just encourage people to think about what those lessons are, how they show up in their lives, and which of them that they might be able to share to help us really get to being a sustainable collective, which is my life's dream. For this planet and for each of us as individuals and as a collective.